Hi everyone again. This is Mike Albu from the Beam Exchange, and we've just been waiting to let a few latecomers join this webinar. Thank you for successfully connecting if you have. We will, let's give it just 2 more minutes. I'm going to let, because we were expecting a lot of people to join this webinar, and we've not got so many come in the room yet, but I think another minute and we should be there. While we're waiting, let me just quickly introduce the Beam Exchange, which is a platform for knowledge exchange and learning about the market systems development approach. And we are very privileged to be able to host these webinars on a regular basis where program implementers and people from the field can talk about the practicalities of implementing market systems development approaches in the field. And today, as you'll see from the slide that's up, we have 4 speakers who are going to be talking about work in DRC. So those speakers are, in order of who's going to present, Marcus Jenal, who is a market systems development and learning expert working with the decision support unit that supports 2 programs operating in DRC. He is an independent consultant with MISO partner, and he's been working with Oxford Policy Management in his role with the Decision Support Unit. And the 2 programs on the ground that the Decision Support Unit is working with are Essor, represented today by Andrea Talbot-West, the program director, and Frédéric Chetcuti, who's head of business and environment reform for Essor. And the second program from DRC that's going to be discussed today is the ELAN program, and that's represented here by the team leader, Nathan Hulley. So I think it's now, since it's now 1:05, we probably should crack on. So I'm going to hand over the microphone to the first speaker, which will be Marcus Jenal.
Thank you very much, Mike. And welcome everyone to this webinar about the private sector development program in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So I'm going to introduce the program very briefly. I don't want to take too much time because I want to give most of the time to the projects on the ground. But just to give us a little bit of background, what is happening in the DRC and what these projects are supposed to do. So in 2013, the Department for International Development, DFID, initiated a very innovative £100 million private sector development program in the DRC, with the intention to improve the incomes of the poor in an extremely complex and conflict-affected environment. The program works with public and private sector stakeholders across the country to create well-functioning markets and deliver a business environment that fosters economic opportunities for poor people. In the original business case of the whole program, the program was built up of 5 components. Firstly, an M4P project, which is now turned into ELAN. It is implemented by Adam Smith International and planned as a 5-year project, which is actually ending in December 2018, which is very soon. The project aimed to realize a cumulative net income increase, difficult phrase, of £88.4 million for 1 million low-income beneficiaries by 2020. So the idea here is that the results will still accumulate after the project ended. It's working across a number of sectors, including agriculture, finance, renewable energy, and transport. The second component in the original business case was designed for the implementation of OHADA, which is a system of harmonized business laws adopted by 17 Francophone African countries. The third component was to be a flexible facility to respond to emerging opportunities in business environment reform, access to finance, and anti-corruption interventions. So these 2 components were taken together as what you see now as the Essor project and are implemented by PricewaterhouseCoopers. It's also a 5-year project aiming to improve the DRC's business environment, and is running until January 2020. Then there was to be a 10 million contribution towards an access to finance fund, which for various reasons wasn't realized. And finally, the business case also described a decision support unit for project monitoring and evaluation and independent result verification. This component is implemented by Oxford Policy Management and is only ending in 2023, as one of its responsibilities are also to keep track of the results after the project have wrapped up. So what you see on this slide, what looks a bit like a very complicated illustration, is actually a visual representation of the complexity of the private sector development context in the DRC, which the business case called the Problematique. The Problematique diagram presents a snapshot of 7 key constraints for firms in the DRC phase, and they are it also mentions the issues driving these constraints, which stem from multiple market failures, government failures, and coordination failures. And what you see there is that they all revolve around 4 key nodes, which are access to finance, market development, business environment, and corruption. Now, the impact logic says that addressing these constraints will enable access to financial services, well-functioning market, and enabling business environment that will foster economic opportunities for the poor, which will result in turn in improved incomes for the poor. However, the business case also argues that you can't address the problem by targeting each of these constraints individually, because private sector development in the DRC and probably elsewhere is inherently complex. So tackling any of these problems in isolation is unlikely to unlock private sector development. So rather, what needs to happen is that the system as a whole needs to change. So therefore, the program's design incorporated the principles of complexity thinking, which say that in a complex system, the future is inherently unpredictable and solutions need to emerge through exploration and experimentation. Or to say it in other words, the solutions for these problems cannot be designed in advance, but an adaptive program is necessary to find out what works and what doesn't. The journey to implementing an adaptive program has been challenging, and the midterm evaluation last year has uncovered a few areas for improvement and some initial lessons, which I would like to share with you here. These lessons are particularly looking at the program level, even though there are obviously also lessons for each project individually. But what interests us here in this webinar is really the program level. So firstly, adaptive management needs management resources. This might sound obvious and even banal, but in this case, this means resources for cross-program adaptive management beyond individual project, which might be less obvious when thinking in a rather traditional project planning mode, where projects are often seen as individual and potentially self-contained entities. So we need additional resources here for this, maybe if you want, meta level of adaptive programming. Secondly, if shared learning between the projects should happen, that lead to adaptive management, there needs to be some sort to group people around for learning, which is a shared theory of change that covers the whole program. While there is a program level log frame and the problematique that I showed in the last slide, there isn't really a theory of change, a proper theory of change around which learning and adaptation on a program level could happen. Thirdly, if we talk about program level adaptation in one project can have a knock-on effect on interventions by another project, which needs to be taken into account and be part of the shared learning efforts. Fourth, maybe again an obvious one, there needs to be space to fail and learn from failure, which is not something new for anyone who has read up about adaptive management. But again, this is particularly challenging on a program level, where program component projects are implemented by 3 different service providers, as in this case, who in other contexts might be competing. it is also challenging in an environment where success is generally measured by numbers. Maybe the last 2 points are more practical. How long should an iteration be for an experiment, for an intervention pilot? When do we say something failed and pivot, or when do we say we need to persist? And connected to this, there has also been an issue here where some interventions have become rather big, maybe too big, and the decommissioning, which is itself a difficult word, the decommissioning needed to be rather well thought through. Maybe the lesson here should be reformulated in a way to say that one should take care not to allow interventions to grow too big, too fast, before it is clear whether they can stimulate positive patterns of change. One person actually unmuted their microphone. If I could just ask this person to mute their microphone again, that would be very nice. Thank you. So to wrap up this introduction, there is much to learn, and we also want to hear the stories from the perspective of different projects. So without further ado, I would actually like to hand over to Nate, who's the team leader of ELAN, who will talk about their experiences on the ground.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and good afternoon, everybody. Just going to quickly share the screen here. So I'm going to give a brief introduction on the ELAN program, and then look forward to getting into more of a discussion, taking your questions. So just as Marcus mentioned in his introduction, ELAN is a 5-year program that's actually wrapping up in a couple of months' time at the end of 2018 for the first phase. And so we're full on in a process now of collecting the final lessons on the program and sharing those. And so this presentation around adaptive management and how we've implemented it at ELAN is based largely on work that's been done by one of our knowledge management consultants named Jason Eves. So just a brief introduction to ELAN. As Marcus mentioned, the DFID DRC PSD business case that's currently being implemented highlighted already in its design just how fragile the DRC context is. And so ELAN was intended from the start to be as flexible and adaptive as possible. So hopefully this discussion is going to shed light on how that's gone on in practice. Just to give you a brief overview of the program, there's a slide there showing, first of all, on the map, the provinces that we're active in, the blue circles showing where we have had offices. We currently have 3 offices, but we've had as many as 5 during program implementation. And during the initial scoping phase, we actually looked at over 30 value chains, with 6 being chosen for the opening portfolio. And then we dropped several of those and settled on our 6 current sectors, which include 2 sectors within access to finance, SME finance and branchless banking, transportation, renewable energy, and a couple of different sectors within agriculture as a whole, including cash crops for export and staple crops that are grown for consumption domestically. So we also focus on several cross-cutting areas at ELAN, including women's economic empowerment, as well as business development and investment facilitation services. And all of this is underpinned by active political economy analysis. So the overall target of the program by 2020 is 1 million people, achieving a cumulative income increase of over £88 million. So the question, as we're looking at adaptive management, and you'll see we have this title here, the Lean Startup Strategy, and we go into a bit more detail in a knowledge management paper that we're going to be publishing in the coming weeks, where we really tried to focus on, as much as possible, on ELAN following some lean startup principles that you see from the private sector. So as a market system development program where we're working primarily to support innovation with the private sector, we really sought to mirror the private sector as much as possible. And so just a couple of questions that we want to quickly answer over the next few minutes. First of all, this sort of thought-provoking question, is adaptive management just good management? What does ELAN's experience demonstrate about the need for adaptive management, and what lessons has ELAN learned on how to empower adaptive management? So
as we've implemented the program and we've been talking with some of our partners, sometimes if we ever mention the phrase adaptive management, they say, oh, you just mean running the business. And I think in DRC this is appropriate, where extreme adaptation is often critical to business success. And a diversified portfolio is required in order for a business or a business group to be successful. And diversified portfolio means they can take risks and have some businesses fail, but also so the more quickly that they can pivot, then when the business conditions shift, the more successful they are. And the conditions do shift very frequently. Over the last few years, we've seen opening and closing of borders or changes in how cross-border trade practices occur. We've had currency shocks, maybe not as big as some other countries around the world, but going from, in 1 month's time in particular, going from 900 Congolese francs to 1,400 Congolese francs to the US dollar. Seeing health crises come up that often have an impact on how programs are implemented and how the private sector operates, such as the actually ongoing Ebola crisis in Eastern DRC. And we've had refugee camps opening and closing, mass movements of internally displaced people as different crises have hit different regions of the country over the last few years. And yet always through this, there's incredible opportunity in the mining sector, as well as for both commercial and smallholder agriculture, and with huge urban populations, especially in Kinshasa, where you have 14 million people as consumers. So what does ELAN's experience demonstrate about the need for adaptive management? As I've kind of alluded to, at ELAN, we see that the landscape of change is actually unchanging since the beginning of the program. And just to hit on a few of these bubbles that you see in front of you, starting with sectors, one of the nice things I think about the flexibility of the ELAN program is that we've been able to add and remove sectors as we've gone along. Just a couple of examples of that is in agriculture. We originally thought that palm oil was actually going to be perhaps one of our strongest sectors throughout the course of the program, but then an international price shock at the beginning of the program made the value proposition for smallholder farmers much less attractive. So while we thought this was going to be one of our main drivers of success, we actually moved out of palm oil altogether. And in renewable energy, where we were originally focused on micro hydro, but investors were actually too skittish at the beginning of the program to move ahead. And also some of the regulation around biofuel was unclear, and so we moved into other subsectors or products within the renewable energy sector. Just looking at geography, when we started the program, there were 11 provinces in DRC. And then when decentralization law that had originally been passed in the mid-2000s was implemented in 2016, the country moved to 26 provinces. So this obviously had an impact on business climate reform as it changed who we could be allied to, and from a business reform perspective, and seeing new constituencies actually shifting because of the shifts in regional borders. And also just seeing geography that the private sector doesn't follow necessarily these geographic boundaries. So while we were given a footprint from DFID on where we should work, we often had to have discussions with DFID on how to work around those borders, because the private sector sometimes their growth plans didn't necessarily take into account our priority provinces. So I'm going to keep moving through these slides, but you can see that, of course, as we went through the program, a lot of data was collected. We tried to be rapid and have interventions, the evaluation of interventions calibrated to the size of the interventions, but it was challenging to remain adaptive and rapid given the size of the program. Team structure was an important consideration for us, as we had offices in up to 5 regions at any one time, and also had needed to have sector leads that would watch out for the overall focus of an entire sector, like access to finance across the whole country. So we ended up with a matrix approach when it came to the team structure. And of course, when you look at the makeup of the team in such a fragile and ever-changing context, we needed to have really strong transitions and handoffs, and that affected both the program team as well as the DFID team, where we saw transition on both sides. So this gets us to this point about looking for the sweet spot when we're looking at how to implement an adaptive program and seeing that individual team members that come on the team often have different views on whether you have lots of, let's call it a more orthodox approach of having long feasibility studies and program documents before getting started with anything, to this kind of anything goes, let's jump on an opportunity and start a pilot tomorrow on an opportunity that we identified today, because we're trying to move at the exact same pace as the private sector. And so what we came to was this notion that we needed to find this sweet spot and market system development where you have sufficient evidence to back up how you're moving forward and which interventions you're proceeding with, while at the same time trying to remain as rapid and flexible as possible. So we kind of came to this, basically the last 3 slides here. We'll just cover some ways that we moved ahead. One is just focusing on having a strategy, but with vision, always looking forward, trying to do fast, fail fast, and then pivot when necessary. This includes, so for example, in the branchless banking sector, where we did an education campaign and then tried to move directly forward with interventions and activities with telecoms, realized that they weren't moving quite as quickly as we expected or hoped that they would, and so shifted to targeting financial institutions instead, looking to expand their agency banking network. So that was just one example of a pivot that we undertook. In terms of the process for empowering the team, basically, again, just noting in terms of that search for the sweet spot, understanding that in order to be fair to all team members and consider all of the proposals that were coming forward from the technical team, that we needed to have a fair concept development process where we developed concept notes and then moved towards implementation phase with implementation design and then eventually partnership agreements. And then similarly, on the external side with DFID, recognizing that DFID did give us flexibility to move forward, that we had to earn the credibility in order to implement effectively, and that there were some cases where we needed to articulate further with DFID exactly how the flexible facility was going to work, but that through open dialogue and collaboration, we were able to find this balance between meeting the log frame objectives while also being adaptive and flexible. And so just finally, the core of this being around having an adaptive team with a diverse background, and finding that we got the best results when we had people from a wide range of backgrounds. For example, in business analytics, people with local private sector knowledge, team members with a background in more traditional development approaches, and bringing all of those people together to have a fruitful exchange to get the best interventions possible. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Andrea and the Essor team.
Thank you very much, Nate and Marcus, for the introduction. So I'm Andrea. Hello, everyone. And I'm sitting here with Frédéric.
Hello, I'm Frédéric.
I'm going to talk you through a few slides today to give you an oversight of the work that we've been doing on the Essor program. And then Frédéric will be on hand with myself to answer your questions. So we wanted to focus on this short time that we've got on how Essor has adapted the implementation of a harder law in the DRC. So just as one example of some of the work that we've been doing. I'm going to talk very briefly around the Essor program, give you an introduction to the wider work that we've done. I'm going to then introduce you to a harder law in the DRC and what that really means. And then the bulk of the time today on my presentation will be on how we've adapted to working in a fragile state and expanded the remit of a harder law to encompass business environment reform. So as Marcus mentioned, Essor was set up in December 2014 as a 5-year program, as an adaptive program being managed by PwC. Initially, Essor had a great number of ideas and opportunities to implement business environment reform in the DRC. But now that we're 4 years into the program, or nearly 4 years into the program, we've really focused and concentrated on the areas where we've got most traction and will be able to deliver before the end of the program. So we're focusing now on 3 areas: a harder law, as already mentioned, access to electricity. This is an international solar mini-grid procurement process. We believe it's the first time the DRC's attempted this, and we've been working to support the DRC government very closely in the activities. We're excited because we've just gone into the request for qualification phase here, and also this month we've been successful in our application to the Green Climate Fund for a grant and loan worth $21 million, and this is match funded by the African Development Bank. So after considerable time of preparation, we're really seeing the results now on this piece of work. For the access to finance, this is something that the program has shared with ELAN and tried to work jointly with ELAN on. It's got huge potential for the DRC, both in the insurance and leasing markets. However, the progress has been, I think, slower than anyone imagined. The barriers have been tougher to overcome, and so this is one area that we're not moving as fast on as we'd expected. I should say, as Marcus mentioned, Essor's role is very much working with the public sector, so working with the ministries and the government departments for this reform to happen, while ELAN is much more working with the private sector itself. So we're sort of top down, bottom up, if you like. So let me talk a little bit about a harder law. So I haven't heard anything about a harder law until I came out to the DRC. However, it has been going for 25 years, and it now encompasses 17 West and Central African nations. And it's a system of business law harmonization with the support of its implementing institutions. They're seen here, the member countries are seen in quite a vivid green on your screen, with the DRC as a deeper green, the large country, the southernmost country here. And the DRC joined the AHADA group in 2012 as its 17th member, so the last country to join this alliance, if you like, around harmonizing the law. The challenges immediately to the DRC was that the AHADA law is based on a French system, and the DRC was historically a Belgian colony, so there's a little bit of difference there straight away. It also was seen very much in the beginning as making a list of the laws that needed to be changed. So the greater opportunity of stimulating the business environment wasn't recognized initially. There's also a very limited amount of adaptation possible with the harder law, and this rubbed up against the strong focus on traditional law in the DRC. Also, there's a strong informal legal approach here and many unpublished legal acts, so it's quite a tough environment to navigate through, another barrier that we initially came up against. Okay, this is my last slide, and I really wanted to spend the most of the time here to try and bring to life what we've done as a program, and in particular what Frédéric has led so successfully. So from experience, we all know that projects and programs have their challenges. And I think Nate very much brought it to life for the listeners here of the number of additional challenges that we have here in the DRC, including security and limited infrastructure. I've focused on 3 challenges that we've really experienced here in the work that we've rolled out. So there's a widespread mistrust, there's a dynamic environment, and there's also a large informal economy. I think it's understandable, looking at recent history, that there is a mistrust in the DRC, both between people and between people and institutions. However, really to make change happen and to stick, you need trust. So the trust is critical to build, but it takes a long time, and it's very fragile. It can easily be lost by misinterpretation or by things not going the way that others expect. Just let me explain a little bit. So when Frédéric took over the AHADA rollout, he met the president of the CNO. Now the CNO is the AHADA implementing department here in the DRC. And Frédéric naturally explained his vision for business environment reform to the president. The president's reaction was to ask Frédéric to leave the country and to go home. So immediately Frédéric understood that he was sort of up against some things here, and that there was a wariness to us coming in and working in this area. There were also cultural differences, and the president was a legal practitioner, so he very much saw it as compiling that long list of laws to change. However, Frédéric's consulting vision sort of won him over, but it took a lot of time and patience and a lot of exchange, flexibility on our side, and also give and take in order to be able to get the traction that we've got now. And Nate mentioned the dynamic environment that we're working in. Very quickly, the number of provinces changed on his project, and also people change quite a lot. So I think within the ministries, it's not unusual for a minister and their staff to change every year. So it means that building up those relationships and that trust also puts us in a vulnerable position as our environment changes. So it challenges the sustainability and the progress that we can make. So what we've done is we've widened the net. So initially, AHADA was seen as being only interested in the Ministry of Justice because it was associated with the law, and that was the only stakeholder that was basically introduced to the program. Now I'm pleased to say that we're working with 7 different ministries. So the number of departments that we're working with is hugely expanded, including the Ministry of Industry and of Economy. Another way that I would like to demonstrate how we've worked with this dynamic environment is by sort of burning bridges. So the company paper records which were held in the provinces across the country, as we're opening up offices to support company registration in those provinces, the historic documents we're consolidating in Kinshasa. So this makes sense for a number of reasons, but it also means that people have to use the new IT system to look up and register companies. They can't go back to the old ways because the records simply aren't there in the offices in the provinces anymore. The last thing I'd like to say on the dynamic environment is actually to encourage the demonstration of public success and public commitment. So we've run a number of publicity campaigns, a number of very public conferences so that people there are committing to the future, which makes it much harder then for that to be eroded when change happens. Lastly, the informal economy. So it's absolutely massive here. It's estimated between 60 to 80% of the economy. Obviously, these things are really hard to measure. But what it means is that there's a reduced tax revenue for the government, which has a knock-on effect that the government has a challenge for international borrowing, such as grants and loans from the IMF. Micro and small businesses really are not able to grow if they're in the informal economy. I was talking with an aid worker just the other week, actually, and she got very excited about the work of Essor, which surprised me because we're working with government agencies, and I thought her work was actually much more interesting and exciting. But she told me that one of the biggest challenges for her is humanitarian aid work, not being able to obtain basic supplies from businesses on the ground where they're working because they're unregistered businesses. And so the humanitarian aid work has to be supplied with just basic stuff being shipped in, which adds to delays and expense, and obviously doesn't support the growth of the local economy, which was, you know, an advantage on the ground. So she felt that if we could succeed in registering the small and micro businesses, then it would make her job a lot easier and the humanitarian aid work a lot more effective here in the DRC. Also, the informal economy, people running the unregistered businesses are frequently harassed for unofficial payments, something else that we're actually trying to test in a project that we're very excited about, which is the last thing I'm going to mention before passing over to questions, which is around the entrepreneur. Now, the entrepreneur is sort of the micro business, the sort of vulnerable, self-employed, if you like. And we're just starting up and running a series of focus groups with the actual proof of concept. And I think this is really the one area that we're being most adaptive on in the program. And it's because we have absolutely no idea whether it's going to work or not. So we're going to offer a bundle of support to the entrepreneur. So in alliance with a local bank, they will be able to open a bank account, have a bank card, get some microcredit. We've negotiated some support from health insurers so they can take out very reasonable health insurance. We're looking at a tax exemption for 1 year, so everything we can to try and promote the formalization of the economy. We kick off the pilot in a 1 month's time with all of these elements in play, but until we actually get people registering, we actually don't know whether it will work. And so we will adapt as we go through the pilot and different pilot sites, learning from what we've experienced in the previous site. I think it's really exciting work, and in the desk research that we've done, it seems that it's incredibly hard and really has been unsuccessful in most places. So if we can crack it, this will be something that I think will be a remarkable learning to capture from Essor. So, Marcus, can I hand back over to you, and perhaps we can move over to questions now.
Thank you very much, Andrea. If you don't mind moving one slide further, that would be perfect. Thank you very much for these great presentations. My first question would actually have been, or might still be, to hear concrete examples of an intervention that did not work as planned. We've already heard some from the projects, but what I'd be interested in is also to hear more about how did you know that it didn't work the way you wanted it to work, and how did you then concretely and specifically in the example case adapt your strategy? Before I give this question out to the panelists, I also want to pull in a colleague of mine from the DSU, from OPM, who will help me, who will answer the questions from the OPM side, so I can moderate the Q&A. He's Jonathan Mitchell, who is the program director for the Decision Support Unit. So why don't I give the word to you first, John? Can you give us a concrete example, or is it even feasible for the Decision Support Unit as such to be adaptive as well, or is it just for the projects?
Thanks very much, Marcus. Jonathan Mitchell here, and thank you for letting me participate in a very interesting discussion. I think the answer to your question, Marcus, is yes, absolutely. I mean, we've heard really good, tangible examples from the two projects. And I think that we learned in Oxford Policy Management that actually to be helpful in this program as a decision support unit, so as a bit of a third party evaluator and support organisation, that it's essential to be as adaptive as the projects are themselves. If I could give two specific areas where I've noticed this, I mean, operationally, and Andrea mentioned this a bit, the DRC is a very difficult environment to work in, and I think that when the Decision Support Unit started a couple of years ago, to be entirely honest and reflecting back on it, I think that I thought it would be like a Francophone Zimbabwe. I thought that there would be a whole range of challenges, but basically the infrastructure would work. What I learned very quickly was that what we all learned was that that's not the case, and what we've done in response to that is that we very much localized the team. Our team leader was remote, and that just wasn't working for infrastructural reasons, for relationship management reasons with the projects. So we've localized the team leader and are building up now a more significant local team. Simple things like getting into the country are more difficult in DRC than elsewhere. So we now apply for visas 3 months in advance rather than the couple of weeks that we're more used to. And we have gently found people that actually want to be in the DRC, and it's absolutely critical because it's one of the most interesting countries in Africa, but you need to work with people who can see that and want to be there. So that's the operational stuff. I think structurally the Decision Support Unit is a bit of an experiment with DFID because sometimes we have to be very objective evaluators, and we do midterm evaluations and annual reviews and verifications. And in that role, we need to be objective, and there needs to be some distance between the projects and ourselves in order for us to be objective. But then at other times, we need, and this is a bit that really interests me personally in what the Decision Support Unit's doing. We're meant to be supporting the projects to have a greater development impact. And to be honest, that's really difficult. You know, these are very different roles. The sort of referee and the supporter. These are different roles, and obviously we're from different organisations. And to be honest, our relationship, the Decision Support Unit's relationship with the projects has had its ups and downs. I mean, what I've learned just in closing is that we've had to invest very heavily in spending time with the projects, explaining what we're doing and what they should be anticipating from what we're doing. And we've had to apply a high degree of professionalism to try and build trust between the projects, and to encourage an environment where we can jointly identify areas where we can add value to the project. So we need really high quality people on the DSU team, you know, to work with such powerful consultants in the field. I think the benefit, just in closing, is that you learn a great deal, and I've certainly learned more from the last year with the Decision Support Unit than I have for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think it is certainly an interesting setup with having a decision support with these specific but very diverse roles. Anyway, let me give the word back to Kinshasa. We've heard from ELAN a couple of very concrete examples how they changed their approaches, but Nate, if you don't mind giving us a bit more kind of practical background, how did you figure out that it wasn't working? And concretely, what is the process in your project that helps you pivot or decide to change and take up a different strategy? And maybe I can link this to one question that came from the audience before. For example, how robust must the evidence be to stop a sub-project in favor of another one?
I'm sorry, we talked about infrastructure here. We lost you for a little while. I wanted to bring Frédéric in just to give you an example of how he's responded to answer the question, the same question as Jonathan, if that's okay, Marcus.
Please, Andrea.
Hello again, this is Frédéric. So I will not take a new example, but on the example given by Andrea just before, this president of the National OHADA Commission. So I want to just to explain how I managed to put back the trust, to put the trust back. In fact, I think I almost forced the dialogue with him, and I segregated the two issues that I had to solve. The first was to run the program at its pace, and secondly, to have a better relationship with him. So I kept going on the activities how it was planned, but besides, I tried to convince him that without a strong belief in the future of the business environment reform, even the legal part of the OHADA would not make sense. While on the other side, the activities and their first results, the quick wins that we got with the activities, showed him that he could trust us and have time to change slowly his mind. This was almost 4 years before, and I was completely surprised 1 month ago at the end of a large attendance workshop. He was answering to the questions of the journalists, and he was only speaking about the business environment reform and OHADA being the root of the business environment reform. So this was the result of the impact on him, but it was also the impact on the government, because I think that now even the government is talking about the business environment reform and not anymore about only OHADA as a standing alone element. Thank you.
Thank you, Frédéric. So this is another great example that we get from Essor here. Let's get back to ELAN still. Nate, if you could describe a bit more concretely one of the examples that you gave during the presentation, and talk a bit about how you could figure out what didn't work well and how you adapted. But maybe let me pull a couple of questions together. So one question from the audience that came in before the webinar is how robust the evidence must be for you to take such a decision, but also what kind of people that you need in your team that are able to work in such an adaptive way and make these decisions.
Sure. So I want to go back to the example that I just briefly touched on around renewable energy and the energy sector as a whole, and the fact that one of our 6 initial opening sectors was microhydro, where we thought that, and this was actually targeted geographically at Kasai, which is smack in the center of DRC and really cut off from an infrastructure perspective from the surrounding countries. And just has a really low level of economic development, and the electricity access in this region is, I think, lower than 5%. So we were looking at, we had done some initial feasibility studies and scoped some projects and thought that we could get some tenders out and really attract private sector investment to build systems that would bring electricity to areas where SMEs could then, or micro businesses could then benefit. And you asked what was the evidence that showed us that this wasn't going to work, and it actually became pretty simple. No investors were willing to actually go in. They had originally said they were interested, but then when it came down to looking at actual documents, it became clear that actually the regulation around this wasn't solid enough to invest in something where it wasn't entirely clear that there wasn't eventually going to be a level of rent seeking that would make that investment unviable. And so that was a pretty clear-cut decision to move away. So we ended up moving out of the sector and out of the region because we didn't see a lot of opportunities there. Now fast forward a little bit, and we found that actually working on bringing in some of the major solar players from around the region to do more home-based units and smaller lamps, as well as improved cook stoves, actually had what was a great market opportunity. We worked with international partners and local partners through a challenge fund. We were able to bring in some quite competent solar players in particular into the DRC market that's now really boosting the growth of these companies and also reducing significantly the cost of energy at the household level. And then from a geographic perspective, we ended up as a crisis of insecurity started increasing in the Kasai region in 2016, we actually ended up opening up a portfolio of activities that we called, or focused on a cross-cutting theme of markets in crisis. And we ended up bringing in our established solar energy partners and cook stove partners from different major areas around the country back to the Kasai region, and held an event in a town called Kananga, which is the capital of one of these regions in Kasai, called Light Up Kananga, where we actually challenged them to come in and open up business, and they have in fact opened up distribution points. So this was really a theme of maybe taking the wrong angle at the start in a particular sector, finding the right angle to go in, having the wrong entry point into a region, and then finding the right entry point later, while building that relationship. Actually, it touches on something that Andrea raised about linkages between private sector activity and the humanitarian aid sector as well, and the ways that the private sector can contribute to the humanitarian response that's ongoing here. I think you asked a question as well just about the team, and just to quickly respond, I think I mentioned at one point what we found actually just having as diverse a team as possible. So having some people with a more traditional, we have a humanitarian advisor, we have people that have come from NGO projects, social development backgrounds. We also have people who have never been involved in development projects at all, that came directly from the private sector and challenged just about every piece of paper that we generated in the project. Why is it necessary? What are we trying to prove? Why don't we just move? And I think that really having all of those different voices, as long as we could get them to row in the same direction, actually turned out to be a really dynamic and productive way to get the best results out of the program.
Great, thank you very much, Nate. Maybe we're almost at the top of the hour. I'd like to give my last question to the Essor team. And the question is, I mean, you touched upon it already quite a bit, but the question is around the challenges to adaptive management considering government or other policy-making bodies with a very or rather slow timeline. And maybe we could combine that with the question of what kind of, how can you adapt to that? I mean, there is not much you can change, I guess, about the timeline of government institutions, but how can you build your strategy around each partner's, also going beyond government, own agendas and timelines and strategies? Maybe very quickly, 2 minutes left till the top of the hour.
Okay, thanks, Marcus. I think that's a really insightful question, and I think we have already said that this takes patience, takes a lot of time to get traction and support here while working with the government. There's also another point, I think, related to this, which is actually when we do change things, the stakeholder management of getting support for introducing new interventions or stopping interventions is huge. And I think that not enough effort maybe didn't go into that in the past, or not enough consideration, because the last thing you want is your beneficiaries and your host country to be frustrated or disappointed with the work that you're doing here. So a lot of time, a lot of effort. Frédéric, did you want to say anything about your experience here?
I think the point is to also be very agile with the budget, to reallocate when necessary from one activity to another, because it is the key point. Activities which are foreseen to be fast become slow, and vice versa. And this is essential because the budget is the basis of our activities.
Thank you. Great point about the budget. This is one question that comes up regularly as well. Okay, thank you very much, all of you, all of the presenters, all of the participants. I'd like to give the word back to Mike Albu for some closing words.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for moderating the Q&A, and of course to all of the speakers for your very interesting presentations. Can I just draw everyone's attention quickly before I close to a couple of links that Isabel has posted in the chat box. There's a webinar feedback form, which I'd be personally delighted if you could fill in, because it's always helpful to know what people think about these kind of events. And there's also a link to our Beam forum where conversations about the webinar will continue, and you're welcome to pick up any of the questions that have been addressed today and continue them in the forum. A recording of the webinar will be posted on a page on the website, on our webinar page, and I don't know whether we have a link to that up yet, but if you can't, if it isn't there in the chat box, you will find it very easily by going to the Beam website and searching on the webinar page. But otherwise, can I just say again my sincere thanks to Andrea, Nat, Frédéric, Marcus for your presentations today, and I hope everyone enjoyed what they heard, and look forward to getting your feedback and any more conversations. If you work for an organization that would like to present in a webinar like this, please contact us again through the website or by email. We're always open to interesting proposals to hear about work on the ground, in particular practical experiences as we have today. So we'd love to hear from you if you'd like to take up the opportunity to grab the mic. otherwise, I'll say thank you again, and we'll close down the webinar now.